most watched news in Western Washington. King 5 News at 10:30 starts now.
Remember that registered sex offender who stole the Victoria Clipper from the Seattle waterfront?
The King 5 investigators have found that he cut off his GPS tracking bracelet 4 times, including right before that heist. Chris Ingalls reveals how the case raises troubling questions about the GPS tracking systems the state uses to keep a leash on its most dangerous ex-cons.
As we sit here right now, what is your status?
My status is fugitive of the law.
25-year-old Red is free to meet us in this park, free to wander, even though the eyes of the law believe they're on him at all times.
It just felt like a joke.
A joke, he says, that was looped around his ankle until he decided to snap it off.
Actually, lo and behold, all it took was a simple push and the device broke. This is the mount.
Red says more than a week after he removed the GPS tracking device placed on his ankle at a local jail.
I'm not a tagged animal.
The law doesn't seem to notice that he's made a home detention jailbreak. Did anybody call to check up on you? Did anybody question whether your equipment was working?
No. Something just clicked in my head that realized, like, why am I playing this game?
Red is not a hardcore criminal, but the state of Washington uses the same type of GPS tracking to keep tabs on its most dangerous and unpredictable ex-cons, about 200 at any given time.
So this is what your field officer, your CCO, would see when they go to monitor their offenders.
GPS software tells a community corrections officer, CCO, if the device is giving a good signal and if the offender is where he should be.
The green gives a good indication that everything is okay.
If it's not okay, or if the offender cuts the bracelet off, the dot turns red, and the CCO gets an alert detailing the problem.
So when you have a strap violation, that means
Mac Peavy runs the program for the Department of Corrections.
I think the system works really well. We've seen a lot of adherence to the program. We've gained a lot of compliance from offenders. It's increased accountability for offenders.
Where are you trying to go?
Samuel McDonough cut off his GPS bracelet and made the most memorable heist of 2013. His theft of the Victoria Clipper because he wanted to sail to Canada played almost like a comedy. But there are no laughs in McDonough's backstory.
He's gotten worse in his behavior, so that frightens me.
His mother says while on GPS monitoring, he was using meth and carrying a knife he claimed for self-defense.
He sleeps here on the floor, and he had a machete he put under his pillow, so I was getting concerned.
Department of Corrections records show McDonough often let his GPS battery die, and he cut off 4 GPS bracelets during 6 months on the program. Often a few days would pass before DOC realized McDonough was untethered. A high-level corrections official complained, somehow we need to ensure we know about the lost or removed GPS units, in an email written after the Clipper theft.
We're following up on that. I'm not sure where we're at. I know that's a continuing investigation.
Then there's the troubling thing that happened on this Capitol Hill street corner 3 months before the Clipper theft. McDonough was arrested because he fit the description of a man who grabbed a woman by the arm. Police reports say he told her he was following her and stated he hadn't had sex in a while. McDonough was never charged, but DOC jailed him for 20 days for letting his GPS battery die before the incident.
He just doesn't like the thing on his ankle.
Records show that even if an offender is in compliance, a GPS device can send out dozens, even hundreds of alerts in a month. John Callahan spent more than 2 decades in prison for molesting 8 children. Last August, his GPS sent 293 alerts that he entered places he wasn't supposed to go. The following month, even more, 372 alerts. DOC says Callahan's homelessness made him a challenge.
A lot of those alerts were largely because he was charging his device, like, for example, at a Barnes & Noble, a place where, yeah, he was prohibited in being, but he needed to charge his device, too. So part of that is part and parcel is having that follow-up conversation with him to say, where were you, what were you doing?
But the system is also prone to false alarms and blind spots.
It had a lot of errors, I'll tell you, and I paid the price for that. It has flaws.
This level 2 sex offender told us false alerts from his GPS got him sent to jail, partly because it didn't work in blind spots at his home.
I don't think they're that worthwhile at all, really.
It isn't just the word of a felon. Last year, the LA Times uncovered a corrections report warning that the public is in imminent danger because GPS units on thousands of California cons are so faulty. Those devices were made by 3M, the same company that Washington State uses and which California dumped last year.
3M and the product that we've been using, we found has had great results.
Something that kind of just happened.
Since this interview, Red has turned himself into the Fife Police Department, which was supposed to be monitoring his GPS unit.
I know that there are other people like me that are circumventing this.
Today, the Fife court, which runs the GPS program for several cities, said it did get alerts from Red's device and did try to contact him by phone, unsuccessfully. Fife seems convinced that his device was damaged but working. Of course, it's taxpayers who foot the bill for most of these systems. The DOC, which monitors the most dangerous offenders, pays $600,000 a year for the service.
A teenager murdered by a sex offender wearing a GPS tracking bracelet. At the time, authorities hailed the high-tech evidence that put the killer at the scene of the crime. But a review of the case by the King 5 investigators unearths evidence never before made public. It raises questions about whether that same technology could have prevented the crime. Chris Ingalls looks at the dangerous sex offender who went home free and the family that paid the price.
An unremarkable Saturday near Vancouver, Washington, turned into the day that would horrify the community of Hazel Dell. Walking down these streets after visiting Walmart, 13-year-old Alicia Nip never made it home.
She was the only niece I had.
Her aunt remembers hoping the happy-go-lucky teen called Lissy was playing a joke on her family.
She was always dancing all over the place and doing silly things and laughing and smiling.
Alicia took this shortcut through the woods, even though it was a known haven for the homeless and drug addicts. Her family found Lissy's lifeless body in the vegetation the next morning, February 22nd of 2009.
Her dad had found her. It was like being hit in the chest. I loved that little girl tremendously. She was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful little thing.
Detectives and news crews fanned out. Among those interviewed was a homeless man who lived in the woods, Darren Sanford.
Did you see any suspicious activity around here on Saturday about 5 o'clock?
Nope, negative.
Were you around here at that time?
Off and on, yeah.
But Sanford must have known his hours of freedom were numbered. A GPS transmitter on his ankle put him at the exact time and location of Lissy's murder. I have to say the GPS is quite amazing, wrote one official from the Department of Corrections about the technology used to crack the case. DOC had placed the tracking device on Darren Sanford for the challenging job of trying to monitor a homeless sex offender who scored the highest possible risk to reoffend on assessment tests. Alone in the woods, Lissy came face to face with Sanford.
I've always assumed it was kind of a random thing, but we don't really know for sure.
But the crime wasn't random at all. Sanford had met Lissy several months earlier at the one place he was not supposed to be, his sister's apartment. Sanford was banned from apartment number 11 and had even gone to jail in 2008 for hanging out with minors here in violation of court orders. But that didn't stop him from coming back to see friends of his sister's young son who liked Sanford, including 13-year-old Alicia Nip. Records reviewed by King 5 don't explain if Lissy went into the woods on her last day with the intention of seeing Sanford.
Maybe he wore a mask that day and she had no idea what the monster she was dealing with.
Internal DOC records show that only after Lissy's murder did parole officers examine Sanford's GPS movements to determine that Sanford continued to visit and frequent the location where minors were known to congregate, including Lissy. And Sanford had been visiting his sister's apartment over the last few days, including the weekend of the killing. But his parole officers apparently missed the clues transmitted by his tracking bracelet. It seems like there's a possibility they could have caught him and stopped this crime.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, it makes me very angry that if that didn't have to happen, that it happened.
There may be.
Anne-Marie Allward is Department of Corrections Assistant Secretary.
I really focus on the fact that with all the tools that were in place, this person made the decision to do a heinous act.
She says DOC uses GPS as a passive tool. Software is always tracking offenders' movements, but alerts and other warnings are not reviewed by staff until the next day or on a Monday after a weekend. DOC says real-time monitoring is far too costly for the department's budget.
It's not an active system. It's not going to be as responsive as what people would see in the movies or on television around somebody in an active system.
DOC's assistant secretary could not say how clues may have been missed in the 5-year-old case, but she says improvements have been made to the GPS program since Lissy's death.
So are we using it well today? I believe we are.
However, DOC staff say the problems identified in this critical incident review after Lissy's death remain.
This was written in 2009. Is it still true today?
Absolutely.
Yes, very much so.
These are leaders for the union that represents community corrections officers, often called parole officers, tasked with responding to GPS alerts.
A lot of them are really struggling with the number of cases that they have.
A single GPS unit can send out hundreds of alerts in a month, often triggered by blind spots or low batteries. And parole officers say they don't always have time to weed out legitimate threats.
The information is only as great as your ability to analyze it and react to it.
That means 200 ex-cons, mostly high-risk sex offenders that the state is tracking, aren't being monitored as closely as the technology allows.
The folks that they're working with are some of the worst people that, some of the most dangerous people that we have in society.
She'd be 18 years old now. She'd be graduating high school.
Amber Neff says no cost is too high to stop the criminals that are the lowest of the low.
These type of men have proven time and time again that they will go after our children.
Good evening. A sex offender tries to kidnap a girl in a Seattle park.
King 5 has learned that records from his GPS tracking device show he'd visited the off-limits park in the past. King 5's Chris Ingalls is live at Benefit Park with more on that, plus an exclusive interview with a 6-year-old victim. Chris.
Dennis, the reason the state puts satellite tracking devices on 200 of its most high-risk ex-cons, mostly sex offenders, is to keep them out of places like this one, Benefit Park on Beacon Hill. Records show that Jesse Brisbane, a level 3 sex offender who lived just down the street from here, may have been testing the waters before he made his move on a little girl.
An underdog.
I'm not doing an underdog.
It's not easy for 6-year-old Taylor Fletcher to come back here.
You think you can go as high as the tree, my love?
Even with her mother by her side, it's hard not to think of the man who approached her in Benefit Park 2 weeks ago.
And he was already standing kind of next to her, so he grabbed her arm and then pulled her.
Police say this was the man who got more than 3 blocks with Taylor before he was stopped by her family and neighbors. Registered sex offender Jesse Brisbane allegedly offered her money first and then got physical.
Got in the hand.
So after all this, what can you say that you have learned? What have you learned from this experience? How can we prevent this?
I learned not to talk to strangers.
Brisbane was wearing a GPS anklet, a satellite tracking device that's supposed to send an alert to parole officers if he enters a park or other places where children are found.
He was so calculated. He was watching our kids. So I think he really just took his time to watch the patterns of the neighborhood.
We've learned that Brisbane has had problems at this very park before. Department of Corrections records show that his GPS device has alerted at least twice here in recent months.
A January alert shows he cruised by the park, perhaps on a bus or bike. It's unclear if parole officers warned him about getting too close to the park. Records from the parole officer's log also show a GPS violation at Benefit Play Area that occurred 3 weeks later. The device showed him at the park for about 2 minutes. Vernay Fletcher says that was about all the time he needed with her little girl.
From the start of him getting off the bus to the end of their conversation, him leaving was about 2 minutes, 2, maybe 3.
Vernay says Brisbane approached 3 of her older children at the edge of the park a month ago. There's no record of an alert for that in DOC documents, but the agency says it is reviewing Brisbane's case. He's in jail now, charged with kidnapping, in a case that many people have agreed could have turned out much worse.
I'm hoping by us talking about this openly that little kids will be, proactive, and if they see somebody, they'll know it is okay to scream.
So DOC says it's not going to talk about this because it is an active investigation right now. Our ongoing series of investigations called Home Free has raised questions about the effectiveness of these electronic monitoring programs that are used so widely to keep watch on criminals. It's an issue that state lawmakers will be talking about when they get together for a work session on Monday. And Vernay says she just might be there to tell lawmakers her family story and the close call.
Imagine if the guy who was convicted of a crime against you was allowed to choose his own sentence. A King 5 investigation finds in some ways that's happening in the world of electronic home detention.
Criminals serve their sentences at home instead of in jail. But Chris Ingalls explains how they can be home free once they leave the jailhouse behind.
Come on in. Go ahead and step up to the counter for me, please.
In jail, you are constantly told what to do.
Right-hand side, please. All the way down.
And when to do it.
When you get done, come on out. Get right up here onto the bar.
But things change when a judge rules that instead of jail, an inmate can be released on electronic home monitoring, EHM.
Just head over the door.
Suddenly, an inmate walks out into a world of choices that could affect how harsh his sentence actually is. In Pierce County, offenders sentenced to EHM are given this list of 15 companies that provide electronic home monitoring on behalf of the courts. A few of them have convenient offices just down the street from the jail. It's not just Pierce County. Many courts leave it up to the person actually serving the sentence to choose who will monitor them.
This is one of the GPS units. It clicks in place.
The companies typically use a GPS ankle bracelet like this to track the offender. The technology is the same, but not all monitoring companies are equal.
Defendants will go out and shop for the most lenient company.
In effect, they're shopping around for the softest sentence.
Well, I know of one company that was giving 4 hours a week of free time.
Steve Hopkins runs Washington's oldest private monitoring company, Stay Home Monitoring.
And do you have an address for your workplace?
In this control room, his employees are keeping tabs on 120 people.
Okay, so what time did you need to head over there?
It's really accurate.
In 17 years, Hopkins has seen the industry explode with newcomers who aren't always upholding the court's orders that offenders leave their homes for work or treatment only.
We had a client that wanted to go to the gym. We wouldn't let him do that without a court order. My understanding is that person went to another company and was able to go to the gym every day.
It may explain why John Burkett was able to hang out at the beach and bars last year while sentenced to electronic home detention following an assault. Lewis County prosecutors got a tip and learned his monitoring company allowed him to do it.
I just thought it was absurd, and it was absolutely unacceptable.
Lewis County kicked Northwest Home Monitoring out of its court system, but the company is still one of the 15 court-approved EHM providers in Pierce County. Pierce County judges are now deciding whether to continue using Northwest after seeing our stories.
The cost of a jail cell like this is about $65 a day, and that's paid by taxpayers. With electronic home monitoring, it's usually the offender paying the bill, about $12 to $20 a day. That means offenders are the paying customers. Courts typically receive only 2 pages about the people they sentence to home detention, a notification of install and then a notice of removal once the sentence is served. In between that time, it's up to the monitoring company to make sure an offender is leaving the house only for work or treatment. If they send the court one of these, a notice of violation by the offender, they could lose a client who goes back to jail. There's an incentive for monitoring companies not to report violations by their paying customers.
Clearly there's a conflict of interest there.
Representative Matt Shea was unable last session to push through what would have been the first state laws targeting the unlicensed and unregulated home monitoring industry.
We can no longer allow people that are sentenced on electronic home monitoring to skirt the system, which is what's happening.
I would welcome a level playing field. Everybody by the same rules.
Hopkins says the honest players in the industry will appreciate regulations. Otherwise, the only companies that will thrive are the ones the criminals choose.
If you don't charge the battery, your electronics don't work. It's pretty basic stuff. Well, a local court admits that it couldn't detect dead batteries on the ankle bracelets of people sentenced to electronic home detention.
That means those offenders could have been home free. King 5 investigator Chris Ingalls reveals that the dead batteries may have gone unnoticed for months.
And I just thought, no. I continually fidgeted with it. I decided to stand up for my right and pull that thing off of my leg. I kept trying to move it, adjust it.
Red shouldn't have been able to get away with it.
I'm not a tagged animal.
But now we know how he was able to yank his electronic home monitoring bracelet off his leg.
All it took was a simple push and the device broke.
Without authorities knowing about it.
There's some additional training that we were
needing, and we got that subsequent to your story, so we have some enhancements that we've made. So we have a 19 of 4, and then we have several that are charging.
Judge Kevin Ringus oversees the City of Fife's Electronic Home Monitoring, or EHM, program.
We have to do a better job staying on top of that.
It keeps tabs on about 90 EHM offenders on behalf of a half-dozen local courts, including Tacoma Municipal, where Red was sentenced on a theft conviction.
Nothing happened when the battery died.
A dead battery means the GPS unit isn't transmitting the offender's location, which is supposed to trigger an alert to authorities. After our story on Red, Fife learned that the OmniLink monitoring software it's been using for 6 months wasn't properly configured.
When we thought he had battery life left in his unit, in fact, he didn't. We were under the impression that the unit was working.
Of course, all of this raises the question, how many offenders other than Red could have left their batteries uncharged and the court never knew about it?
Fife officials seem to believe it's a small number.
I mean, it can happen, but we're talking about 1 out of 800 people that we've monitored. So most of these people want to comply.
However, the King 5 investigators found other evidence Fife isn't keeping a tight leash on offenders. We looked at records from Pierce County District Court, which has about twice as many offenders that are monitored by a different EHM system. Pierce County's court has received about 500 notices of violation by offenders sentenced to home monitoring in the last year and a half. In that same time period, Fife's EHM program has only violated 3 offenders, reporting back to the sentencing judge that these men broke the rules of home detention.
It may just be the difference in offenders. I'm not sure who they're monitoring versus who we monitor, the parameters set by the judge.
It's GPS unit, so it will track you wherever you go.
Steve Hopkins is the former jail superintendent for Grays Harbor County.
And do you have an address for your workplace?
Who now owns a private EHM monitoring company. He's surprised by Fife's lack of reports to the courts.
Only 3 violations. I would say someone's probably not doing their job.
Just refer to me as Red.
Red agreed to this interview in February as long as we didn't reveal his actual name, to highlight what he called an unjust and ineffective EHM program.
It just felt like a joke.
He's now paid the price, being sentenced last month to 29 days more on Fife's EHM program.
We've taken steps to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Our home free stories have shown not only problems with public agencies like the Fife Court, but also with the private companies that do this monitoring here in Washington State. And one reason for all this is that Washington doesn't have even basic standards for the electronic home monitoring industry. Really, very little written in the law here.
Good evening. Lawmakers are pledging to make changes following a series of King 5 investigations.
They're talking about new laws to crack down on criminals who are supposed to be on home detention but are actually going home free. Chris Ingalls is live at the Criminal Justice Training Center in Burien, where the State House of Representatives Public Safety Committee met this afternoon. Chris?
Yeah, Mimi, this is a place that preaches law and order, so perhaps it's fitting that lawmakers came here today. They agree there aren't many laws and there's plenty of disorder in the way this state monitors electronically criminals.
This is State of Washington versus Jesse Richard Brisbane.
This morning, high-risk sex offender Jesse Brisbane pleaded not guilty to kidnapping. He's accused of grabbing this 6-year-old at a Seattle park 2 weeks ago. A bold move considering the level 3 sex offender was wearing a GPS transmitter on his ankle at the time of the crime.
Not being reported at all.
Just a few hours after Brisbane's court appearance, state lawmakers met for this work session.
There are a lot of concerns that offenders are getting away with supposedly being monitored, but actually being free to go and do whatever they want, unaccountable.
This work group is looking at Washington's loose rules surrounding electronic monitoring of criminals by public agencies and even private companies that make up their own rules.
The judge says you're going to be on home monitoring.
But the judge oftentimes doesn't know what that means. And we verified that by calling many judges around the state and asking them what it means, and it varied a lot jurisdiction by jurisdiction and judge to judge.
That means criminals who are supposed to be under close watch are on the loose.
The group watched an excerpt from Home Free, our investigative series that showed a man accused of killing his friend and stuffing him into a shopping cart after being released on home detention. A man who peeled off his tracking bracelet undetected. And this man, whose monitoring company allowed him to take trips to the beach and bar while serving a home detention sentence. Representatives from the electronic monitoring industry were also at today's meeting.
I think most of us do a very honorable job of monitoring people and reporting.
But lawmakers say most isn't good enough.
We are working in a bipartisan way to regulate the home monitoring industry much better, and we will have legislation in the next session.
Just one example of something lawmakers can do. They can pass new licensing requirements and standards for the home monitoring industry. Right now, for example, a criminal could run one of these monitoring companies. There are no background checks, so you would essentially have a criminal monitoring criminals. Lawmakers say that has got to change.
The K-5 investigators have repeatedly found violent criminals going home free. Rapists, child molesters, and robbers were being released from jail and put on electronic home detention.
King County judges said they'd put a stop to it, but investigator Chris Ingalls has obtained new data from the county that shows jailhouse doors are still opening for suspects in violent crimes.
In a back alley in White Center.
Hey, I haven't seen you in a long time. Yeah. You know who I am, right? Yeah. Tell me.
A chance meeting between two women who shared a terrible night in this very place. One of them, Elisa Castle, was the witness.
People there were having sex, and it looked to me like one of them was a woman who was unconscious.
Elisa saw two men, Michael Ortiz and Terry Ellis, taking off their clothes.
He was flipping her like a rag doll back and forth.
And pulling down the pants of the defenseless woman.
They were going to rape her?
As we were talking to Elisa in the alley, she spotted the other woman in this story, the victim.
Yeah, this is all right. Yep, it's okay.
Marissa is 38 years old and more or less living in the alley in White Center's business district.
Unfortunately, I was extremely intoxicated. I still feel a little bit of shame and guilt because of my drinking, but it does not matter. I mean, I've been going through a rough time and I'm homeless.
Ortiz and Ellis, both felons with long rap sheets, were arrested when Elisa and another witness stopped the attack and called police.
I would have been raped for sure.
But Ortiz, who Elisa says was the primary attacker, caught a break after his arrest in February. A few months later, King County Superior Court Judge Jim Rogers dropped Ortiz's $75,000 bail and permitted his release from jail on electronic home detention. An ankle bracelet would monitor his whereabouts. He could stay here at his father's house, just a few blocks from the alley.
I don't know. He could be walking right by me, and that would scare the living life out of me.
Ortiz's case is one of several that contradicts what King County's presiding judge told us last month, that Superior Court judges are no longer releasing suspects accused of violence or sex crimes on electronic home detention, EHD.
You can't put someone charged with a violent crime on EHD. It hasn't always been that way, but that is the current law.
Now the court has backpedaled on that statement and said it's not against the law, but it is against the court's own policy to release suspects in violent crimes on home detention. That policy was enacted more than 6 months ago by the chief criminal judge, none other than Jim Rogers, the same judge who allowed Ortiz to serve his time at his family's home.
I think the person who was victimized doesn't even have a home to go to, and the person who victimizes her has the option to go stay at Daddy's house. It's terrible.
Judge Rogers did not respond to our questions about the Ortiz case, but in jail records, we found suspects accused of rape, child molestation, and kidnapping, a total of 30 suspects in violent crimes who've been released on home detention in the past 6 months in violation of the court's supposed policy. Although Judge Rogers approved Ortiz's release, jail documents say his father wouldn't let him come home, so Ortiz was never actually released from jail.
I'm scared to death to know that guy's walking around somewhere.
We told Marissa that he never walked out of jail. In fact, Michael Ortiz is now serving a 15-month prison sentence for the crime. But Marissa says other violent crime victims shouldn't have to worry that their attacker is home free.
We shouldn't have to look over our shoulders when we walk down the street.
The King County Court explained to me why it made its policy. There is a law against sentencing violent criminals to home detention. Judge Rogers, the chief judge, believes that the intent of that law was also to bar home detention as an option before trial, too. But we still don't know why he would allow someone with a long criminal history and no job, someone like Ortiz, to go from a $75,000 bail to home detention, which allowed him to go home free.
Now, it sounds like we need some rule changes here. Is the legislature looking into it?
You know, our investigations have shown that there really aren't any standards or laws for the public or private home detention industry, and that's resulted in a lot of problems. Lawmakers have a hearing coming up in a couple of weeks as they put together a bill, and judges will be part of that discussion. Chairman Roger Goodman says he has bipartisan support for a bill next session, so yeah, I do think there are going to be changes in the law here.